Hello, beautiful people. Welcome back. If you enjoy our stories, please subscribe and leave a like. It means everything to us. Please share this video with someone you care about and switch on post notifications so you won't miss any future videos. Thank you for always supporting. Now, relax and let's begin. Sandra Cole had the kind of face people trusted before she even spoke. She was gentle without being weak, warm without being loud, and thoughtful in a world that rewarded performance. 3 days before her wedding, her aunt, Mrs. Agnes Cole, kept touching her cheek and saying, "My daughter, God has favored you." Everywhere Sandra turned, she heard the same thing. Edward Bassey was handsome, polished, well-spoken, and from a respected family. Women at church smiled with envy. Cousins whispered, "See your life." Sandra smiled back, but deep inside, her joy never settled fully in her chest. At night, when the laughter faded, Sandra's mind wandered to the little things she kept excusing. Edward liked controlling the final word in conversations. If she asked uncomfortable questions, he kissed her forehead and called her too deep. Once, when she asked why he hated being challenged, he laughed and said, "You think too much, babe." It sounded playful then, but it stayed with her. Now, surrounded by lace, satin, and congratulations, she felt guilty for even having doubts. "Maybe I'm just scared," she whispered to herself, pressing her palm against her heart as if she could calm it. Sandra met Edward at a corporate engagement dinner where everyone seemed to be selling something, including themselves. He stood out because he appeared calm in a room full of noise. He noticed when her glass was empty, remembered where she worked, and asked thoughtful questions without sounding rehearsed. By the end of the evening, he said, "You're different. You don't chase attention." Sandra had laughed. "Maybe attention just doesn't like me." He smiled and answered, "Then it has poor taste." It was the kind of line that should have sounded practiced, but Edward delivered it with such control that she believed him. He courted her carefully, not too fast, not too slow. He met her aunt respectfully, spoke with Kevin like a man trying to earn ground, and sent voice notes instead of dry text. Sandra, tired of men who wanted the comfort of her presence without the labor of commitment, slowly relaxed. Edward always spoke like a man going somewhere serious. "I don't date for sport," he once told her. "I build with intention." That sentence wrapped around her heart. By the time he proposed, most people said she had finally met a complete man. Kevin said nothing. He only watched. Vera, Daniel, and Natalie Briggs were not just Sandra's friends. They were her history. Vera had carried Sandra through the season after her mother died, bringing food she never asked for and staying quiet when words felt like pressure. Natalie had been the one who made Sandra laugh again after a painful breakup years earlier. Together, they formed the small circle Sandra trusted most. In wedding week, they moved around her like sisters, fixing details, calming vendors, adjusting fabrics, handling relatives, and teasing her when she became too serious. Bride of the year, Natalie sang one afternoon, making Sandra finally laugh. But even in those warm moments, something felt uneven. Natalie smiled too quickly, talked too brightly, and sometimes looked at Sandra with eyes that seemed wet for no clear reason. Vera, on the other hand, had become more distant. She remained helpful, but Sandra noticed how her tone changed whenever Edward entered the room. Once, during a fitting, Edward touched Vera lightly on the shoulder while passing, and Vera's body stiffened so visibly. Sandra almost asked questions. Instead, she told herself everybody was under pressure. "It's wedding stress," she murmured. Still, the silence around her friends had started sounding louder. Kevin Cole was the kind of man who wasted no energy pretending to like what he did not trust. He loved Sandra quietly but fiercely, and because of that, he observed Edward more carefully than anyone else. He never accused him openly, never tried to stop the wedding, but his questions were always sharper than the rest. During one family dinner, Edward spoke at length about vision, structure, and legacy, and everybody seemed impressed. Kevin only leaned back and asked, "Do you listen as well as you speak?" Edward laughed, but Sandra saw the brief flicker in his eyes before his charm returned. Sandra and Kevin had grown up leaning on each other after loss, but their closeness had become more restrained with age. He respected her independence, yet he remained protective in practical ways. "Read every paper," he told her more than once. "Love is not an excuse for carelessness." Sandra usually rolled her eyes. You act like I'm marrying a criminal. Kevin's face remained unreadable. I'm acting like the world rewards men who look respectable. Edward noticed Kevin's resistance and covered it with politeness, but Sandra could sense the private tension. Edward liked admiration. Kevin did not offer it, and Edward never forgot that. As the wedding drew closer, time became loud. Tailors called at odd hours. Decorators changed flower plans. Family members argued over seating and traditions. Sandra moved through those days, smiling, thanking, correcting, and swallowing small frustrations. Edward was impressive in public, calling vendors, reassuring elders, making everything look smooth. But in private, his attention leaned less toward romance and more toward what came after. Once we marry, we simplify everything, he told her one evening. No unnecessary boundaries. We become one. Sandra nodded, distracted by guest lists, but something in his tone felt less tender than final. Then he brought up her late mother's apartment again. It was Sandra's only major inheritance, and though she rarely talked about it emotionally, it represented safety. Edward called it our future asset and suggested they formalize how it would fit into their marital structure. Marriage means trust, Sandra, he said. What is mine is yours. What is yours is mine. She wanted to agree, wanted to be the kind of woman who did not sound suspicious, yet the urgency around those papers felt too deliberate. Can we discuss this after the wedding? She asked. Edward smiled, but his jaw tightened. Why delay unity? 2 nights before the wedding, Sandra found herself replaying Edward's proposal in painful detail. It had happened on a rooftop with amber lights, soft music, and just enough privacy to feel intimate without seeming secretive. He had taken her hands and spoken like a man unveiling a future already secured. I want one life with you, he had said. One home, one direction, one loyalty, one purpose. She cried that night because those words touched the lonely parts of her heart. After years of uncertainty in relationships, being chosen so clearly had felt like rest. Now, sitting alone with her veil folded beside her, she heard the proposal differently. Edward had spoken often about ownership, unity, and outside influences. Marriage survives when nobody can divide what's joined, he had said. Back then, it sounded wise. Now, it felt loaded, almost instructional. Sandra pressed her fingers to her temples and sighed. Why am I doing this now? She whispered. She hated herself for revisiting beautiful moments with suspicion. Yet, memory had shifted shape. What once sounded like devotion now carried the cold outline of control. She wasn't certain of anything, but certainty no longer felt safe. Natalie Briggs had always been emotional, but this was different. In wedding week, she seemed trapped inside herself. She laughed too quickly when no one had said anything that funny. She volunteered for tasks, so she would never sit still. When Sandra hugged her, Natalie sometimes held on too long, then pulled away as though afraid her guilt might become visible through skin. One afternoon, while sorting bridal accessories, Sandra found her staring blankly at a pair of earrings. Nat, where are you? Sandra asked gently. Natalie forced a smile. Just tired. Weddings are like military training. The truth was heavier than fatigue. Natalie had been carrying shame for months, and every bridal song, every family prayer, every excited phone call made her chest tighten. More than once, she had tried to tell Sandra something important, but fear always won. Not only fear of losing Sandra, but fear of what the truth would make her look like in her own eyes. She kept telling herself there would be a better time, a softer time, a less destructive time. But truth did not become kinder because it was delayed. It only became heavier, and Natalie was beginning to sink beneath it. Vera Daniel was harder to read because she had always been composed. She did not cry easily, and she did not speak carelessly. That was why Sandra noticed the change. Vera still showed up, still handled details, still protected Sandra from unnecessary stress, but there was something stern behind her silence now. She never lingered alone with Edward. If he entered a room, Vera found something else to do. During a family lunch, Edward joked, Vera, you behave like I owe you money. Everyone laughed except Vera. She replied, not money, and took a sip of water. The table moved on, but Sandra noticed. Later that evening, Sandra asked softly, are you angry with me about something? Vera looked startled. You? Never. Sandra hesitated. Then why do you seem far away? Vera smiled faintly. the kind of smile that admitted nothing. I'm just exhausted, Sandra. Weddings turn people into unpaid staff. Sandra laughed, but her heart stayed troubled. Vera's distance did not feel like jealousy or irritation. It felt like caution, like someone standing too close to fire and pretending not to feel heat. Sandra wanted to push deeper, but she was already afraid of what too many questions might uncover. The night before the wedding was crowded with rituals. Older women prayed over Sandra's head, anointed her lightly, and gave advice she had heard her whole life. Be patient. Do not answer every wrong. Marriage is endurance. A wise woman keeps her home with silence. Each sentence was offered as wisdom, but under Sandra's skin, it sounded like warning. She sat in the middle of the room, smiling politely, while her stomach tightened. Why did preparation for joy always sound like training for pain? Her aunt noticed her stillness and squeezed her hand. Don't be afraid, my daughter. Every good thing comes with responsibility. That night, Edward sent her voice notes full of affection. By this time tomorrow, you will be my wife, he said softly. No more distance, no more separate lives, just us. Sandra listened twice. His voice was tender, steady, almost comforting. Yet, instead of peace, she felt a strange pressure building in her chest. She wanted to run to him and believe. She wanted to trust her future. Instead, she lay awake long after everyone slept, staring at the ceiling with tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. Please let me not be making a mistake, she whispered into the dark. The wedding morning arrived with perfume, camera flashes, rustling wrappers, and the sharp movement of many people pretending not to be stressed. Makeup artists moved around Sandra's face like priests at an altar. Her dress hung nearby, white and impossible. Cousins rushed in and out with shoes, pins, and forgotten chargers. Mrs. Agnes cried twice before breakfast. Look at you, she kept saying. Your mother would have been so proud. Vera adjusted the veil with careful hands. Natalie carried the bouquet, smiling too brightly. For a little while, Sandra felt carried by the beauty of the moment rather than crushed by it. Still, something in her remained detached, as though her spirit had stepped back to watch from a distance. Edward's messages kept coming. Ready for forever? You're about to become Mrs. Bassi, I can't wait to see you. Sandra stared at the screen longer than necessary before replying with simple hearts. Everyone said she looked radiant, but inside she felt hollowed out by nerves she could not explain. She kept scanning faces, searching expressions, listening to tiny changes in tone. It's normal, Vera told her. Brides are always shaky. Sandra nodded, but her body felt less nervous than warned. 5 minutes before the ceremony, Sandra slipped away from the bridal room to breathe. The corridor near the groom's waiting room was cooler and quieter than the buzzing rooms behind her. She adjusted one earring, pressed her palm against the wall, and exhaled carefully. Then she heard Edward laughing. At first, she smiled reflexively, comforted by the familiarity of his voice. But the door to the waiting room was not fully shut, and the next sentence cut through the air with a cruelty so sharp it froze her where she stood. I slept with her 2 friends, Edward said, almost casually. There was a stunned laugh from another man. Then Edward continued, voice low and smug. It helped me know who was really loyal. Besides, after this marriage, she won't have a choice. Nigerian women don't live over embarrassment. The words struck Sandra like a physical blow. Her bouquet slipped, petals shaking, her chest tightened so hard she thought she might collapse. It was not only betrayal, it was contempt. The man she loved was speaking of her like a trapped thing, not a human being. Sandra pressed her hand over her mouth to stop any sound. In that corridor, her future cracked open without warning. Sandra did not burst into the room. She did not scream Edward's name or drag Vera and Natalie into the hallway. Somehow, through the roaring in her ears, she bent, picked up her bouquet, and walked away before her legs gave out. The bridal room was still full of voices when she returned. Natalie looked up immediately. Sandra, where did you go? We were looking for you. Sandra forced her face into stillness. I'm fine, she said, though her voice sounded distant even to her. She sat down slowly. Every breath feeling borrowed. Something inside her had turned from pain into ice. Now every glance from Vera and Natalie looked suspicious. Every kind gesture felt infected. Sandra stared at them with new eyes and hated herself for it. If Edward spoke the truth, then the betrayer had roots inside her closest circle. If he lied, then he was even darker than she had imagined. Natalie reached for her hand. "You're cold. Are you okay?" Sandra pulled gently away. "Just nerves." Vera watched her a moment too long, as if sensing danger beneath the calm. Sandra looked down at her dress and thought, with quiet horror, "I am dressed like Joy while standing inside ruin." Sandra slipped into a side restroom and locked the door before dialing Kevin. The moment he answered, she knew she would cry if she let herself hear too much concern. So she spoke flatly, quickly, like someone reporting an emergency. "Kevin, listen to me. I just heard Edward tell someone he slept with my two friends. He said after the wedding, I'll be too embarrassed to leave." There was silence on the line, not because Kevin doubted her, but because his anger had become too controlled to sound. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Sandra, breathe. What else?" She swallowed. "He's still been pressuring me about the apartment papers." Kevin's tone changed immediately. "What papers exactly?" Sandra told him about the documents Edward wanted signed after the ceremony, linking her late mother's apartment to their future marital structure. Kevin exhaled slowly. "Sandra, this is bigger than cheating." She leaned against the sink. "What do I do?" He did not answer immediately. Then he asked, "Do you want to stop this now and let him rewrite everything? Or do you want enough proof that he cannot survive the lie?" Sandra closed her eyes. Her answer did not come quickly, but once it formed, it did not shake. Kevin moved fast. Within minutes, Barrister Bassey Okon arrived discreetly at the venue under the excuse of final family documentation. He was a calm man with a face that gave away nothing unless he intended it. Sandra met him in a private office behind the church hall, still in her dress, still breathing as though her ribs were too tight. Kevin stood near the door while the lawyer opened a folder and began explaining what Sandra had nearly signed away. The post-wedding documents were not simple symbolic papers. They were structured to gradually merge access and control around her late mother's apartment. Sandra stared at the pages with disbelief. He said it was just to show trust. Barrister Bassey's eyes lifted gently. People who are honest do not usually rush trust into paperwork during emotional moments. Kevin's jaw tightened. The lawyer continued, "If Mr. Bassey is acting in bad faith, confronting him now may only drive him into denial. But if he walks willingly into expectation, witnesses and legal grounds become stronger." Sandra sat very still. Her heart wanted to collapse, but her mind was sharpening. "So you are saying I should marry him?" she asked. "For long enough," the lawyer replied quietly, "to expose what marriage was meant to protect." Sandra made the decision with a kind of calm that frightened even her. She would go ahead with the ceremony, not because she had forgiven Edward, not because she was weak or afraid to stop it, but because she finally understood the kind of man she was dealing with. A public accusation before the vows would allow him to deny everything, call her emotional, twist her pain into instability, and retreat behind his polished image. But if he crossed into marriage, expecting access, expecting control, expecting papers, then his own confidence would become the evidence that trapped him. Still, making that decision did not make her strong in a glamorous way. She felt sick. She wanted to tear the dress off her body, call the whole world into the hallway, and ask why women were always expected to endure devastation quietly. Instead, she stood up, wiped her face, and asked Barrister Bassey what the plan would require. Kevin watched her with grief in his eyes. "You don't have to do this," he said softly. Sandra looked at him. "I know, but if I don't, he'll keep hiding in respectability." She inhaled shakily. Let him believe he's won, just for 1 hour. The music began, and the church rose. Sandra stood at the entrance in her white dress, bouquet resting against hands that no longer trembled from nerves, but from something colder. From where she stood, Edward looked radiant and composed every inch the admired groom. He smiled when he saw her, and the sight almost broke her. Just minutes earlier, she had heard that same man speak of her future like a cage. Now he stood before God and family, looking like a promise. Sandra lifted her chin and began to walk, each step precise, each breath a silent act of war. As she moved down the aisle, memories flashed cruelly. Edward waiting for her after work with takeout. Edward praying over her when she had a fever. Edward kneeling with a ring, speaking of forever. All of it folded painfully against the truth she now knew. Guests smiled, some dabbing tears, unaware that the bride was walking not toward a life but toward a trap she intended to reverse. "She looks happy," someone whispered. Sandra heard it like a voice from another world. By the time she reached the altar, her face was serene. Only her heart knew it had stopped trusting everything. Pastor Reuben began the ceremony with warmth and dignity, speaking about love, covenant, and faithfulness. Sandra stood beside Edward with her head slightly bowed, hearing every word through the distortion of pain. When it was Edward's turn to speak his vows, his voice was strong and tender. "I choose you with honesty, loyalty, and all my heart," he said, looking directly into her eyes. Sandra's stomach twisted so sharply she nearly lost her breath. There was no hesitation in him, no visible shame. He lied beautifully, like a man who believed words were tools rather than truths. When Sandra repeated her own vows, she spoke clearly enough to move the congregation. Her aunt wept openly. Natalie looked down. Vera's face remained unreadable. Kevin stood in the second row with his hands locked together so tightly the veins showed. Every clap, every prayer, every amen felt like another layer of irony pressing onto Sandra's skin. But she did not falter. She understood now that weakness was not crying. Weakness was surrendering your reality to someone else's performance. So she gave Edward exactly what he needed, confidence. And with each false vow he spoke, he walked further into the ruin he had built himself. After the ceremony, congratulations exploded around them. Cameras flashed, cousins hugged, family friends rushed forward with blessings and jokes. Edward moved through it all with glowing triumph, his hand at Sandra's waist, his smile broad and possessive. "My wife," he said more than once, as though savoring ownership. Sandra endured each touch with controlled stillness. She smiled for photographs and accepted greetings, her body acting on discipline rather than feeling. Kevin stayed nearby, saying little, watching everything with the quiet focus of someone waiting for the right moment to close a door behind danger. Then Barrister Bassi approached Edward with formal ease. "Mr. Bassi, before the reception begins, there's a quick document session the families would like settled." Edward's expression brightened exactly as Sandra expected. "Perfect," he said. "Better to start marriage on structure." Sandra almost flinched at the word. He turned to her warmly. "Won't take long, babe." She nodded. "I know. That single hour between the church and reception stretched endlessly." Guests moved towards celebration, while Sandra followed the man she had just married, knowing she was accompanying him, not into a new life, but into exposure. She had never felt more alone. The private office felt different now. When Edward entered, expecting routine signatures and smiling convenience, he slowed almost immediately. Sandra was seated at the far end of the table without her bouquet. Kevin stood behind her like silent steel. Barrister Bassi sat with documents arranged neatly before him, and two older family witnesses remained present near the wall. A small recorder rested in the center of the desk. Edward's smile thinned. "What's all this?" he asked, laughing lightly. "You people look like you're about to negotiate a company merger." Nobody laughed back. Sandra looked at him fully for the first time since the ceremony. There was no softness left in her face. "I heard you," she said. Edward blinked. "Heard what?" Her voice stayed calm. "In the hallway, you and your friend." "I heard everything." For a second, his expression emptied. Then his charm rushed back in. "Sandra, whatever you think you heard," she cut in quietly. "You said you slept with my two friends. You said after marriage I will be too embarrassed to leave." Edward let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "You can't be serious." Sandra's eyes did not move. "I am more serious than I have ever been." Barrister Bassi slid one folder aside. "The expected property documents will not be signed today," he said. Then he placed another set of papers before Edward. "These are the preliminary grounds for annulment based on deception, coercive intent, and bad faith." Edward's face tightened, despite himself. "Annulment? Have all of you lost your minds?" Kevin stepped forward and touched the recorder. "Repeat your joke then," he said coldly. "Say in front of witnesses what you said before the wedding. Explain your interest in my sister's inheritance too." Edward looked between them, and for the first time uncertainty entered his posture. He tried to recover with ridicule. This is absurd. Men talk nonsense before weddings. Bachelor banter. Sandra overheard and panicked. Sandra leaned forward slightly. You didn't sound like nonsense. You sounded practiced. Barrister Bassey began outlining the document structure Edward had been pushing, explaining how access to Sandra's mother's apartment would have shifted over time. Edward interrupted sharply. That was normal marital planning. The lawyer met his eyes. Then why the urgency? Why today? Why after the vows? Edward opened his mouth, but the answer did not arrive smoothly. The room remained too calm for manipulation to breathe properly. When Natalie was brought into the room, she was already crying before anyone spoke. She stood near the door, twisting her fingers, unable to meet Sandra's eyes. Edward's head snapped toward her with instant warning in his face. But Natalie had already reached the edge of herself. I'm sorry, she whispered before sitting down. Sandra felt her chest tear in a completely new place. Hearing Edward brag had broken one layer of trust. Seeing Natalie crumble beneath the weight of truth broke another. Tell it, Kevin said quietly. Natalie shook her head once, then nodded as though surrendering to the inevitable. She admitted Edward had slept with her months earlier, during a period when Sandra and Edward were arguing often and speaking less. He told me it was over, Natalie cried. He said you people were only managing appearances until the official break. Sandra stared at her, pale and motionless. Natalie's words stumbled over themselves as she described shame, regret, and every attempt to bury the truth beneath wedding activity. I hated myself every day, she said. Every time I zipped your dress, every time I smiled at you, I hated myself. Sandra's lips parted, but no words came. Pain was suddenly too large for speech. Vera entered the room differently. She was tense, but not collapsing. Her eyes moved first to Sandra, then to Edward, and finally to the documents on the table. So, it has reached here, she said quietly. Sandra looked at her with fresh dread. Did you sleep with him too? She asked, her voice smaller than she intended. Vera's expression hardened instantly. No. Edward cut in quickly, almost angrily. Vera, don't start drama now. That one sentence made Kevin's gaze sharpen. Vera turned to Sandra and spoke slowly. He tried with me. More than once. When I refused, he said if I ever told you, he would destroy our friendship. The room changed. Sandra frowned through the blur of grief. Destroy our friendship, how? Vera laughed bitterly without humor. By doing exactly this, making you believe there was something to confess. She explained how Edward had cornered her after a get-together months earlier, framing his advance as concern, then as temptation, then as threat when she rejected him. He said, if I spoke, you would think I was jealous of your relationship. Sandra's mind reeled. One betrayal had been real. The second had been planted like poison. Edward had not merely cheated, he had designed confusion. He understood that suspicion could isolate Sandra faster than truth. Kevin and Barrister Bassey agreed the matter could not remain inside one room. Before the reception started, both families had to know enough to understand that celebration was no longer possible. Mrs. Agnes was the first elder called in. The moment she saw Sandra's face, she knew something terrible had happened. Edward's mother, Mabel Bassey, arrived next in an expensive wrapper, irritated at being interrupted. What emergency cannot wait till after the reception? She demanded. When Barrister Bassey summarized the deception, the infidelity, and the attempted property scheme, silence cracked across the room like thunder held too long. Mabel recovered first. Infidelity, she scoffed. Are we pretending men don't make mistakes before settling down? Mrs. Agnes turned with a pain-filled fury Sandra had rarely seen. Do not insult my daughter with that nonsense. Chief Daniel Briggs arrived, heard Natalie's involvement, and nearly staggered with shame. Natalie, he said hoarsely, you did this? She bowed her head. Voices rose. Some elders begged for privacy. Others insisted the marriage must be protected from disgrace. Sandra listened as though underwater. The discussion around her life sounded disturbingly familiar. Appearances first, wounds later. She finally stood and said, enough. Nobody will protect me by hiding him. The reception hall glowed with expensive expectation. Lights shimmered over decorated tables. Music waited politely in the background. and guests were still seated with the innocent restlessness of people anticipating celebration. When Sandra entered in her wedding gown holding a microphone, many smiled automatically, expecting a sweet speech or playful surprise. Edward followed behind, less composed now, though still trying to carry himself like a man in control. Kevin and Barrister Bassey remained close. Mrs. Agnes's eyes were red. Across the room, whispers began before Sandra even spoke, because something in her face looked too calm to be bridal. She lifted the microphone and let the room settle. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice startlingly steady. "But this celebration is over." The hall froze. Sandra continued. "Today I married a man who believed vows would protect lies, betrayal, and hidden intentions. They will not." Gasps rippled everywhere. Someone stood up. Someone else dropped a glass. Sandra did not rush. This union is already under legal challenge because it was entered through deception and bad faith. Edward stepped forward. "Sandra, stop this." She turned to him, eyes clear. "No, you wanted silence to protect you. You will hear the truth, protect me." The days after the wedding collapse were cruel in ways Sandra had not fully imagined. Instead of immediate sympathy, she met suspicion. Phone calls arrived, disguised as concern, but carrying accusation. Why go through with it if you already knew? Couldn't you have handled it privately? Did you have to disgrace both families? Some people avoided Edward publicly, while quietly defending him in conversation. Others outright blamed Sandra. "She is too proud," one elderly woman told Mrs. Agnes. "Marriage requires patience." Sandra listened to such comments until her ears felt bruised. Truth had not made her free immediately. It had made her lonely first. Social media worsened the wound. Photos from the ceremony circulated alongside half-baked rumors and polished lies. Some people called her brave. Others called her dramatic, unstable, and vengeful. Sandra stopped answering most calls. She stayed inside, moved carefully through rooms, and cried only when nobody was nearby. Mrs. Agnes knocked softly one evening and found her staring at a wedding photograph she had forgotten to delete. "Did I do too much?" Sandra asked in a broken whisper. Her aunt sat beside her and held her. "No," she said firmly. "You did what many women are punished for, even imagining refusing to be trapped politely." Being a bride, an almost divorced woman, within the same hour created a strange kind of grief. Sandra could not mourn normally because the humiliation was still active, still being discussed, still being reshaped by strangers. Her dress was packed away too quickly. The gifts remained unopened in corners like accusations. She heard songs from the wedding playlist playing in her head at random moments and felt sick. Natalie kept sending messages asking to talk. Vera sent fewer words, giving space instead of pressure. Mrs. Agnes worried aloud about Sandra's future, then apologized for sounding afraid. Even comfort came wrapped in anxiety. Kevin became the quiet structure holding the house together. He screened calls, met Barrister Bassey, handled practical fallout, and made sure Sandra ate even when she insisted she was not hungry. One afternoon, he found her sitting outside with no shoes on, staring at nothing. He sat beside her without speaking. After a while, Sandra said, "I feel stupid." Kevin shook his head. "You feel wounded." "That is not the same thing." She looked at him with tears gathering. "He made me look like the problem." Kevin's voice stayed steady. "Only to people who need lies to remain comfortable. Time will separate them from truth." Edward did what men like him often did best. He tried to reclaim the narrative before the truth hardened. He told some people Sandra was unstable from wedding stress and had misunderstood harmless conversation. He told others Kevin had always hated him and used the incident to destroy the marriage. To a few especially useful listeners, he implied Sandra regretted the wedding and invented scandal to escape commitment. Because he was polished, because he sounded wounded rather than defensive, some believed him. He seemed so calm, people said. Surely there is more to this. Sandra learned painfully that charm often survives longer than fact, but the cracks in Edward's image widened day by day. Barrister Bassey moved the annulment process forward, and the suspicious structure of the property documents became harder to dismiss as routine trust. Kevin uncovered smaller patterns to previous deaths. Edward hid under impressive language, repeated attempts to gain leverage through relationships, and inconsistencies in stories about his finances. Vera quietly provided dates and details from Edward's advances toward her. Natalie's statement was formally documented. The more facts gathered, the more Edward's performance thinned. He had spent years building a respectable mask, but masks do not survive prolonged light without beginning to peel. Sandra finally agreed to see Natalie in private weeks later. They met in Mrs. Agnes's sitting room on a rainy afternoon, with thunder rolling softly in the distance. Natalie entered looking smaller than Sandra had ever seen, her eyes swollen, voice weak, shame hanging around her like wet cloth. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Natalie began carefully, not dramatically, recounting how Edward approached her during a period when Sandra and Edward were constantly arguing. "He knew exactly when I was lonely too," she said. "He kept saying you had already checked out emotionally." I wanted to believe he was telling the truth. Sandra listened with tears in her eyes and anger burning beneath them. Natalie did not excuse herself. She admitted that after it happened once, she should have told Sandra immediately. Instead, she panicked, hoped it would vanish, and buried herself in wedding preparations as if effort could cancel betrayal. "Every prayer over your marriage felt like punishment," Natalie said, crying openly. "I did not deserve to stand beside you." Sandra finally spoke, voice trembling. "You didn't just wound me, Natalie. You stood inside my joy while carrying the knife." Natalie bowed her head. "I know." Sandra looked away. "I cannot forgive you today, but I needed the truth." Vera came days later, not with tears first, but with clarity. She sat opposite Sandra and told the story she had carried too long. Edward's first attempt had come after a group outing, when he offered her a ride and began speaking strangely about Sandra's emotional limitations. When Vera shut him down, he laughed it off. The second time he was bolder, suggesting that loyalty between adults could become complicated. When Vera threatened to tell Sandra, he became cold. He said, "You would never believe me," Vera admitted. "And the terrible thing is, I was afraid he was right." Sandra's face tightened with fresh hurt. "So you kept quiet?" Vera nodded, eyes shining now. "Yes, and I was wrong for that, but I never touched him." Then she gave Sandra the final piece that changed everything. Edward had admitted during one of those confrontations that confusion was useful. He literally said uncertainty makes women weak. Vera said bitterly. Sandra felt the room tilt. Edward had lied about sleeping with Vera, because if Sandra doubted both friends at once, she would be too emotionally shattered to think strategically. That revelation settled everything. Edward had not only betrayed love, he had weaponized emotional collapse as a plan. Months passed, and the noise around the scandal began to shift. The annulment moved forward. The apartment remained securely Sandra's. More people, now faced with facts rather than gossip, quietly changed their tone. Some apologized awkwardly, others simply became silent. Edward's reputation did not explode all at once. It weakened the way foundations weaken after hidden water damage, slowly, until the cracks could no longer be denied. Sandra was still wounded, still rebuilding, but the wound was no longer confusing. She had names for what happened now: deception, coercion, manipulation, betrayal. Naming a thing did not erase pain, but it ended some of its power. One evening, standing alone on the balcony of her apartment, Sandra thought about that impossible day. She had walked down the aisle with a dead heart and come back out with her life. People still retold the story incorrectly, reducing it to scandal, pride, or drama. But Sandra knew what it truly was. She had not married Edward because she was weak. She had married him for 1 hour because he believed vows could trap her, and she refused to let legal status outrank truth. "You did not bury me," she whispered into the quiet night. "You only revealed yourself." And at last, she felt free. We've come to the end of the story. Drop your thoughts in the comment section. Leave a like, share, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification. Thank you so much for watching.